if you've heard at least one thing about the Second Doctor's run, it's that there are quite a lot of Base Under Siege stories.
You know the drill. Everyone's favourite dishevelled clown wanders into a heart of operations of some description, and coincidentally the monster of the week attacks this place, and Mr. Who helps the personnel with keeping the monsters out and maintaining the facility. Going by this extremely broad, loosey-goosey description, about half of his era would at least be somewhat covered by that sentence. So naturally, there's a few wrong people out there who claim that, because this is a fairly frequent story format, the Second Doctor era is therefore extremely repetitive and potentially uncreative.
Well, guess who's about to slam dunk that misconception into oblivion? Alright, so first I'm going to channel my inner Matt and be super pedantic here, because the term Base Under Siege seems to be used super liberally.
Now, the fandom definition of the term Base Under Siege refers to the scenario that I opened the video with. A group of characters are trapped in a confined space and have to fend for themselves against the villains who are trying to enter and are picking them off one by one.
Thing is though, this term isn't actually accurate to the actual definition of the word siege.
Fandom tends to use siege as a synonym for invasion, even though by definition they are not the same thing. While an invasion is defined as the direct taking over and occupation of a territory by force, a siege is defined specifically by enemy forces surrounding or blockading a territory with the aim of pressuring those inside to surrender, whether it's by cutting off possible escape or outside supplies, or by bombarding the captives into submission. So for example, when we talk about the Siege of Troy, that refers to the period of time the Greeks spent patrolling and blockading Troy's perimeter, but not actually the eventual invasion and subsequent fall of the city itself. So going by a super literal definition of Base Under Siege, the only times in the Troughton era where the exact scenario of an enemy force outside a base pressuring those inside a base to surrender under threat of destruction is in episode 4 of the Moonbase, and in episode 6 of the Ice Warriors.
We have brought up reinforcements with other weapons, and you have one chance, and you must open the entry port, and you cannot stop us now, and you will all be completely destroyed.
Leader Clint, surrender or die.
What the blazes?
Surrender now, or I will blast your base to fragments.
Such repetitive, many formulaic.
But as I said, people tend to use the word siege synonymously with invasion, so for simplicity's sake, let's just pretend like they mean the same thing.
So if we're entertaining this notion and lump in any stories where monsters are invading a base, and by base I mean a scientific base as the stereotype typically refers to, that adds Fury from the Deep and the Seeds of Death.
That's like 4 out of 21 stories total. Those are pretty evenly distributed as well. Wow.
But that's where we encounter another frustratingly vague part of the term. Despite the trope being called Base Under Siege, many will state that the base in question doesn't have to be literal. The format can still apply if the territory under attack is some other form of organisation, establishment or fort, as long as it's an enclosed space of some kind. So if we go by that logic and widen the parameters further, that lumps in the Power of the Daleks, the Abominable Snowmen, the Web of Fear and the Wheel in Space.
Ugh. See what I mean though when I say this term is very loosely applied? Then again, I guess confined space under invasion doesn't exactly have the same ring to it, does it?
Oh, and out of interest, let's just throw in a couple of other stories that often get labelled as Base Under Siege, even though on a structural level, that label doesn't apply at all. In this case, the Macra Terror and the Tomb of the Cybermen. But I just want to cover them anyway for the sake of it.
So look, I'm not going to deny that some, or maybe even all of these stories do showcase elements of a base under siege, or fort under invasion, or whatever broad label we want to christen this trope with.
But pedantic nitpicking about semantics aside, what I want to do here is showcase to you that a basic premise is not the be-all and end-all of narrative creativity. Just because these stories all happen to feature a base or holdout of some description, with a monster or 12 lumbering through the corridors, that doesn't automatically mean they are just homogeneous repetitive runarounds with nothing individualistic to offer outside of different casts or filming locations. I want to analyse all of these examples and showcase to you what each of them do in addition to being Base Under Siege stories. That said, I do also want to point out when I think this label has been carelessly applied, regardless of whether or not it actually describes the events on screen, or if I think it's an extremely oversimplistic or exaggerated description of what occurs.
Sound good? Let's go.
The power of the Daleks. The newborn Second Doctor and friends arrive at a human colony on Vulcan that has unearthed a space capsule, and upon further investigation they soon encounter suspiciously cooperative and obedient Daleks.
So first things first, does this story fit the trope? Maybe?
But, not gonna lie, I think Base Under Siege is quite a grossly blunt summary that ignores the nuance of the situation. I see the Daleks' movements in this outing far more as an infiltration rather than a straight-up invasion or siege. They manipulate themselves into the inner workings of the colony, worming themselves deep into the vulnerable cracks of human greed, and playing the long game until they have the full advantage. They don't even start the full-on armed invasion and massacring of the colony members until well into episode 6, so if 5 episodes of underhanded manipulative tactics and mounting tension, resulting in a final episode of utter chaotic payoff, showcasing just how committed the Daleks are to their Machiavellian ways, is too typical and bog standard for you, then I don't know what to tell you. Structure aside though, that viewpoint is also a huge disservice to the themes of the story, ranging from its commentary on science without regulation, how easily revolutions can become corrupted from the inside, and of course the exploration of the new Doctor's character through the lens of his psychological power play against his old foes, the Daleks.
So yeah, far more than just an average Base Under Siege.
The Moonbase. The Doctor and friends visit a weather control base on the moon, where a mysterious illness and disappearances among the staff serve as warning signs for a Cybermen plan.
Now, as discussed earlier, this story does indeed qualify for the extremely literal definition of a base under siege, so I won't deny that it does fall into the general fan consensus of a confined space getting invaded as well.
But that said, I do want to draw attention to the methodology of the Cybermen's attack on the base, and how it evolves significantly throughout the course of the narrative. For the first half of the story, their incursion takes on a more stealthy and lurking nature, being rather gradual with their contamination via the neurotropic virus and kidnapping of the patients. Then once the Doctor has exposed the source of the illness, they reveal themselves full on, and events escalate into a base-wide hostage situation. And then finally, once the Cybermen inside the base have been eliminated and the base itself sealed, the remaining Cybermen on the outside resort to the actual siege tactics in their attempt to regain the advantage.
I feel like the actual evolution of the villain's schemes and tactics often go ignored when people discuss Base Under Siege stories, and I think that's unfair.
And to add the cherry on top, thematically the story has themes of environmentalism, a metatextual enthusiasm for space travel which parallels the real-world space race of the time, and of course discussions of the value of emotions in regards to the Cybermen.
Very juicy stuff.
The Macra Terror. The Doctor and friends arrive at a human colony that seems eerily chipper and idealistic on the surface, but in reality, it's making efforts to suppress any acknowledgement of its exploitative, parasitical underbelly.
This one is going to be relatively blunt and to the point. This is not a Base Under Siege story.
At the point where we first join this environment in the narrative, it's already under the authoritarian rule of the Macra. The act of them quote-unquote sieging the colony has already occurred before what we see on screen. Therefore, what the story is actually about is a revolution, about overthrowing a corrupt and oppressive regime that feeds on the unquestioning obedience and enslavement of others.
Pretty distinct and not a Base Under Siege. Moving on.
The Tomb of the Cybermen. The Doctor and friends become embroiled in an archaeological expedition to investigate the apparent extinction and final resting place of the Cybermen, but some members of the party have shady intentions.
Another one I'm going to be very adamant about, because this also isn't a Base Under Siege story.
For starters, the first half of the tale doesn't align with that description at all, being more of an investigation of this derelict Cyberman infrastructure and the hazards within, which I feel would at least partially classify it as an exploration story with hints of suspense. As for the second half, some argue that events escalate to a Base Under Siege format when the protagonists end up locking the Cybermen in their tombs below and holding out against their attacks, but I don't know, to me that has vibes of you breaking into someone else's house when they're sleeping, them waking up and attacking you, and then you locking yourself in their bathroom and then calling that a Base Under Siege.
Like, I'm pretty sure the context of whose base it is kind of matters.
Then again, some argue that the story technically is a Base Under Siege if you view it from the antagonist's perspective, which is an interesting take, but kind of debunked by this exchange in episode 3.
Well, don't you see? They only wanted superior intellects, that's why they made the trap so complicated.
We knew that somebody like you would come to our planet someday.
So yeah, all that aside though, even if you are unconvinced by my arguments, surely the intrigue of the traitorous Klieg and Kaftan, the archaeological coding of the environment from the logical puzzles, to the effigies of those entombed, to even this thing that resembles a sarcophagus, the Cybermen's primary goal of self-preservation and rebuilding their ranks, in contrast to their first two stories where they were more focused on destruction, and the wonderful character moments concerning our leads, all provide some engaging food for thought that keeps the adventure from plunging into any mundanity concerning story structure, right? The Abominable Snowmen. The Doctor and friends attend Detsen Monastery, where the formerly timid Yeti have become aggressive and are terrorising the Tibetan landscape, with the cause emanating from the sullied heart of the monastery itself.
Now, part of me does find the Base Under Siege comparisons somewhat more understandable with this story, but then again, I think the movements and the whereabouts of the villains do blur the lines somewhat.
Like with the Macra Terror, the base in question was already hijacked and corrupted long before the events of the on-screen narrative, as the Great Intelligence had been possessing the High Lama Padmasambhava for hundreds of years, and throughout the story he dictates the movements of his Yeti as he pleases, occasionally making them attack the monastery to scare the other monks away, but for the most part having them patrol the countryside and guarding specific places of interest. Sieging or invading the monastery isn't really the main goal of the Intelligence because, considering its vantage point, it simply doesn't need to do that. It already has power there.
I consider this story to be more of a revolution, or rather, with the Buddhist themes of the tale, a spiritual cleansing.
The Ice Warriors. The Doctor and friends visit a futuristic base in the midst of an ice age, purposed with keeping the glacier from advancing any further, but their mission is jeopardized by the discovery of a Martian frozen in the ice.
As stated earlier, this story does count as an extremely literal instance of a base under siege, so I won't deny that the more generalised fan trope does apply here as well.
That said, I will state that invading the base doesn't become the Ice Warriors' goal until well into episode 5, when the Doctor is forced to tell them about its power source. So, the conflict for the majority of the story leading up to that point actually centres around the Ice Warriors' revival and their hostage situation over Victoria, and not actually immediately succumbing to the trope. Hell, when the first Ice Warrior Varga is awakened inside the base, it ditches the place with Victoria in the span of the same episode, rather than staying to immediately take over.
So, consider that a subversion if you like.
Still, if you need some other reason to care, thematically the story has a lot to say about the drawbacks of either relying entirely on automated computerized decision-making, or of subscribing to a stubbornly anti-scientific mentality, ultimately advocating for science but enacted through the lens of human accountability.
Live, laugh, love that for them.
The Web of Fear. The Doctor and friends end up in the abandoned London Underground, where the Yeti have returned and are at large, and the Great Intelligence has been awaiting its reunion with the Doctor, having set an elaborate trap for him.
So the Base Under Siege label gets applied to this story sometimes because the protagonists maintain a fortified position within the London Underground that does get encroached on by the Yeti a couple of times. But I'd argue that, with characters constantly exiting the fortified position and venturing into the unknown of the dark underground tunnels, where the majority of confrontations with the Yeti actually take place, the adventure becomes less about holding the enemy out of the base, so to speak, and more about characters trying to reach places of safety at all, and uncertainty about their whereabouts. Plus, I dare say the whodunit aspect that becomes explicit in episode 3 and is maintained throughout the rest of the adventure is the far more prominent narrative technique than the Base Under Siege trope. It's a very psychological story in that regard. And additionally, with the narrative detail of this conflict being targeted specifically at the Doctor, I dare say the personal sheen for our main protagonist should help it stand out from your bog standard formulaic entry. Fury from the Deep. The Doctor and friends arrive at a sea gas refinery in the midst of a crisis. Pipe blockages, instances of sabotage, generally stressful working conditions, and people becoming ill after having been in contact with a mysterious weed. So look, I'm not going to deny that the formula is pretty applicable here, or at the very least the fandom definition is. There is significant plot focus on a base getting invaded by a strange alien force. Although it must be remarked that some of my previous points apply here as well, particularly the antagonist's methods evolving throughout the narrative and escalating the tension, from lurking to possessions to direct attacks to kidnapping and so on, as well as the interesting psychological and Lovecraftian perspective of a threat that hides in the infrastructure of the base itself, in the walls, the pipes, the vents, etc. But above all, I'd quite like to draw attention to a thematic element of this adventure that I feel doesn't get the attention or recognition it deserves. It's a story about anxiety. From the rapid heartbeat sounds of the seaweed creature, paralleling the frantic panic of the characters and encouraging the same emotional response from the viewer, an aspect highlighted in Victor Pemberton's own novelization of the story, so you can't accuse me of reading too hard into it, to the harsh and stressful working conditions for those under Robson's employment and explosive temper, to the mounting distress for Victoria that compels her to ultimately end her travels with the Doctor because she just can't have the emotional stability she yearns for on the TARDIS. The conflict doesn't just stem from the monster of the week trying to claw its way into a confined space, it also partially comes from the overwrought emotions of the characters themselves. That said, it's not a total demonization of anxiety as a feeling. After all, Victoria's screams of terror are what actually incapacitate and eventually defeat the seaweed creature. Therefore, painting a moral that feeling scared isn't intrinsically a bad thing. In some contexts, fear is a superpower. For goodness sake, Moffat. I just thought I'd put that out there and help to widen your perspective of this narrative a bit more. The Wheel in Space. The Doctor and Jamie, having some technical difficulties with the TARDIS, end up on a space station that is in peril from a meteor storm and the Cybermen. Alright, so of all the Troughton stories that get the Base Under Siege stigma, this is the one where I feel the least drive to defend it, but I will stand by the fact that the first 2 episodes are actually pretty bold. Episode 1 is a bottle episode with the Doctor and Jamie plunged into this uncomfortable situation of the TARDIS breaking down, and thus they have to make themselves at home on the rocket. Then in episode 2, when they get escorted to the wheel itself, Jamie has to handle the introductions and exploration of the environment, which showcases quite a cute little fish out of water story. Also, it's a companion introduction, and when you stop and think about it, Zoe's struggles with her purely logical mind makes an interesting contrast to the very nature of the Cybermen themselves, so yeah. That said, by the end, the adventure does kowtow more towards the typical invasion of the base narrative, as the Cybermen take more prominence and roll out their extremely convoluted plan. See my Bad Apples video on the Wheel in Space to learn more. Still, at the risk of sounding cringe, I just want to say, it ain't a base under siege, it's a spaceship under siege. I hate me too, let's move on. The Seeds of Death. The Doctor and friends visit a future Earth that has become entirely dependent on teleportation technology for a functioning society, and they are just in time to help combat the Ice Warriors, who are trying to use this dependency to their advantage. So it is true that a significant section of this story involves the Ice Warriors straight up invading the lunar Tiamat base to hijack the system for their own terraforming and invasion of Earth. That said, to say that's all the adventure has going for it would be disingenuous, as the Ice Warriors' terraforming plan involves sending poisonous seed pods through to Earth. Another significant portion of the runtime is dedicated to themes of environmentalism. Scenes of devastation as the pods multiply and lay waste to the outside world, and a rising sense of tension for how the ecosystem would be saved from this violation. Additionally, there are themes of hubris in there, as humanity relying solely on this newfangled technology and abandoning the old methods is the Achilles heel that the villains are able to exploit. By tying this into the metatextual enthusiasm for the space race of the time, and imagining a future scenario where the technology used in said space race was considered antiquated and unimpressive, it provides a message of never forgetting your roots, and celebrating the accomplishments of the past as well as those of the present, and that sometimes old methods can make up for the shortcomings of when a newer method fails. And that pretty much wraps this analysis up. Now, as I said, I am not denying that the Base Under Siege format is a recurring staple of the Second Doctor's tenure, but what I wanted to call attention to was the other elements present in these stories that I feel go overlooked by those who generalise the era or shrug it off as nothing special, as well as pointing out when I feel the description is too broad for particular instalments. This is one of the show's most creative periods, and I do not think it is a downgrade from Hartnell's tenure whatsoever. Rather, it is an equally innovative run with just as many perks. No, it was not always Base Under Siege all the time, but it was always based under siege.